Okay, now we're going to turn and talk about the Federalist Papers, but before I do, I want to mention one thing. We mentioned Hume. Hume, the great skeptic, philosopher, took aim at the social contract theory, and he thought that it was had too many flaws to be true. Well, Hume was a Tory. That means he supported the old traditional view that the king had the right to rule, and there you go. I mean, it just seemed like the best way to keep order in society. After all, it had a very long tradition going back for many thousands of years. But Hume's attack on the social contract theory was that even if you could find a state of nature, and Hume was a historian, in other words, he did a lot of history, writing a history of England and so forth. He was primarily known in his day as a historian, not a philosopher. But he says, even if you could find a historical period in which people lived in the state of nature and came out of that state of nature, either as Locke or as Rousseau had said, what about all the people who live in that society subsequently? For example, I mean, maybe the Founding Fathers did create a social contract and so forth, and everyone bought into that, and it was ruled by consent. Well, did I consent? Did I get to sign off on this contract? No, I didn't. Well, what Locke says is that, well, the fact that I stay here in this society and that I don't leave is my consent. It's a tacit consent. And so if I don't like it, I can leave it. Of course, in Locke's day, if you didn't like it, you could go off to some area of the world that was totally unruled and just live out in the state of nature again. You could remove yourself from any society and just go back to living in an uncivilized, wild wilderness type of area. Not so much today. There's no square inch of the earth today that's not claimed by some country, somewhere. In other words, there's no place in the world that's not governed by social contract. Even Antarctica, which no country can claim, is governed by international treaty, for example. And so everywhere in the world is governed by some social contract now, or some rule of law. So you can find no place that's truly outside the rule of law. And so this seems to be a problem for the theory according to Hume, who rejected social contract theory. But here in America is where social contract theory really came to its pinnacle expression in the Declaration of Independence and in the American Constitution. The Founding Fathers take not only this theory, but a great deal of experience in the early days of the American colonies before the United States emerged, and essentially bought into this idea that consent is necessary for rule. So let's take a look at some of the Federalist Papers. Now, why are the Federalist Papers so important? If you want to understand what the Constitution says, your first place to go is the Federalist Papers, because there you have Madison, probably the quintessential political genius in American political history. I mean, there's no one that rivals him in his political savvy. There we have Madison and Hamilton, his equal in that respect, and John Jay laying out arguments for the U.S. Constitution. In other words, why the U.S. Constitution is needed, why it's good. In other words, this is a careful exposition, step by step, of every part of the U.S. Constitution and why it was necessary. Now, they wrote these in 1787, 1788. They were published in newspapers around the country, New York, for example, and they were there to try to persuade people to ratify the new Constitution. Now, there was a Constitution in force at that time already called the Articles of the Confederation. This was formed in 1777, and the Articles of the Confederation were our first Constitution, if you will, as a country. But it's a very different type of scheme. And it became quickly obvious to many of the Founding Fathers, especially Hamilton, that this is not going to work. This is too weak. The union between the states after the Revolutionary War was far too weak. It could be easily split up. We'll look at some of his arguments here in just a minute. But the idea was of these Federalist papers, and there were scores of them, are try to persuade people. Now, there are also some other papers, the anti-Federalist papers. We'll take a brief look at those as well here in just a minute. Now, the great and powerful nations of Europe threatened the weak and easily divisible fledgling USA. You had 13 colonies that had become 13 states, but they were all sovereign. And under the Confederation, Articles of Confederation, their sovereignty gave them so much power that the Union itself was weak. Okay? And so, one of the problems was that under the Confederation, there was no standing army. There was no standing navy. These are very expensive to maintain, by the way. But support for these things was voluntary, and therefore it was rare. Most of these fledgling states had their own problems, and they had their own issues to deal with. Ultimately, the money would have to come through taxation, and people in that day and age were not friendly to heavy taxation. And so very little support ever came to the national level. And so it was a very weak entity. The ultra-simplified and streamlined nation could not confront the complexities of international power. Spain lay to the south in Florida. France had a foothold on the continent as well in Louisiana and Canada. England definitely was not happy with the American Revolution of just 10 years ago. There were a lot of threats that were looming, and the USA was a prime land that could be easily invaded simply by one of these national entities gaining a toehold somewhere in the continent and dividing them. Say like, hit anywhere, hit landfall anywhere in the middle of the colonies, say like North Carolina, and split the nation in two and separate it out and then divide and conquer. So the original framers of the Articles wanted a weakly centralized power. I mean, it's understandable why they did not want a strong centralized power. They had disdained the centralized power of England. They just fought a war against such rule. And they didn't want that kind of rule. They wanted their government to be very close geographically and socially to the people. And so states enabled that. And so the states had a great deal of sovereignty. The Federalists, this would include Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and many, many other founding fathers, believed that the unity of the states was so weak that it was practically inviting invasion. Moreover, there were other problems. Shays' Rebellion had just taken place, in which a rebellion of 4,000 people rose up and were creating huge problems. And so these type of rebellions, because the people had so much freedom, these type of rebellions threatened the existence, the existential, it was an existential threat to the existence of the nation. So the government needed more energy, more power, to fight the invasions if they come, or to fight rebellions and uprisings. In other words, stability is becoming a big problem here. Moreover, under the Articles of Confederation, the government was horribly inefficient. There was a fear of anarchy that was going to emerge due to unchecked freedoms. Moreover, they sat on the edge of a huge continent that was mostly empty. I know this is somewhat controversial, but in that day and age, there were fewer and fewer American Indians, and the thought was that this country will ultimately expand out to the west. At this time, the Mississippi River is the far west, okay? The explorations of Lewis and Clark out to the far west coast of Oregon had not taken place yet, but they will soon after in the next couple of decades. But anyway, westward expansion was also a key problem because this nation needed to be able to expand and to grow with that geographical expansion. And so all agreed that the idea of consent and liberty was necessary for a government. But now it seemed as if there needed to be another principle in place, and that would be the unity of the country. But there were many worrisome concerns. Now, the Anti-Federalists during the 1787-1789 period between the finalization of the U.S. Constitution and its final ratification in '89, there was a group known as the Anti-Federalists. They're not as bad as they sound, but without their opposition to this new Constitution, we would not have things today such as the venerable Bill of Rights that we have. These Anti-Federalists, one of their biggest objections was that the Constitution did not have guarantees for individual rights. And individual rights had become a big matter in most of, or a matter of enormous concern in most of those states. For example, Virginia had their Bill of Rights that ensured that each citizen of that state had rights as an individual. And Madison will take those and use them as a kind of a template, if you will, for the U.S. Bill of Rights. But the Anti-Federalists wanted to hold on to the Confederation for several reasons. The new plan looked to them to be very aristocratic, and it diminished rule by consent too much. So the idea of having, two houses, a House of Representatives and the Senate, and then a judiciary that's separate and so forth, this all started to look a little bit aristocratic. And so they did not like aristocratic ideas. I mean, they had tried to get away from aristocratic ideas by founding this new country. They disdained the idea of an overbearing federal government. Okay? They did not want a centralized power that had the ability to reach in their lives, insinuate into every area of life, and control them. All right? So, moreover, the judicial tyranny seemed to them to be a big problem. That is, once this judiciary was split off and became its own branch of government, they feared that the judiciary could become too powerful. And the separation of powers idea was something that just had not gelled well. And that's what the Federalist Papers tried to do, is explain that very concept in great detail. Moreover, they felt that a strong federal and central government could not properly address the needs of a widely dispersed people. And so people varied a lot, north to south, from coast to, up to the mountains and so forth. People lived in some pretty diverse places geographically and had different needs. And they didn't want a centralized authority trying to make decisions for everyone because they felt that they couldn't make good decisions that would adequately address everyone. So there were many anti-Federalist papers as well, usually published under the name Federal Farmer or Brutus. And the Federalist Papers that we look at now, even though Madison and Hamilton and Jay penned them, they were published under the name Publius. People loved to take a pen name back then to promote their ideas. Madison in Federalist 10, one of our readings, it argues for the advantages of a large republic over a small republic. A large republic has some muscle and some abilities qualitatively that a small republic doesn't have. A large republic can control violence and factions. Shays' Rebellion of 4,000 people in Massachusetts was certainly in Madison's mind as he penned this, because this had just taken place in the last couple of years. And it was a kind of a shock to the nation of what had happened in Shays' Rebellion. And so excessive, unbridled freedom stokes unrisings. The more freedom people have, the more freedom they have to go to extremes and to rise up. And so a large republic would be able to overcome some of these shocks. State governments were unstable, and rival parties often upset the civic virtues of peace. Superior forces of crass majorities could easily overrun minorities. And so this was going to be a problem that you see even in the smaller state legislatures and state governments and so forth, was just how in the world do you prevent the minorities from being overrun by a stronger majority? And so that's one of his claims there in Federalist 10. He writes, quote, "Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an element without which it instantly expires." But you can't just eliminate air because it enables us to breathe. Just because it feeds a fire you can't eliminate it. And so freedom fuels anarchy, but you can't eliminate freedom just for that reason, just as you can't eliminate oxygen because it fuels fire. And so it's the same with liberty, he says in this, this analogy that he's making here. So many things cause factions, but one thing fuels factions more than others. There are many motives, but one thing fuels it more than others, and that's the unequal distribution of property. In other words, some people making more money, or having more land, or somehow or another through their family being able to have more natural resources such as land. And so a pure democracy can't control factions and uprisings. In fact, pure democracies tend to give rise to anarchy. Look at the idea of pure democracy in the French Revolution. Now, at the time that he wrote this, the French Revolution had not yet occurred. The French Revolution is going to occur 2 years from about this time, 2 years later, but then it's going to have its massive meltdown in the Reign of Terror, where the mobs, with this idea of everyone being equal in every possible way, is going to melt down into the Reign of Terror, where 30,000 people will be executed. But that's what they're trying to stop, is this idea of excessive freedom, and pure democracy that might lead to uprisings. Pure democracies quiver on the edge of anarchy, and they jeopardize property and peace. And even equal property does not stave off anarchy. Even if everyone had equal properties, that still would not satisfy people and keep them from uprisings. A republic is a kind of representative rule, and it can absorb these shocks. We're going to talk about what a republic is, what does the very word res publica mean, and what the federal republic means. Okay, this is what the Founding Fathers are trying to put into place. A republic with representative rule means that a small number of citizens are elected by the rest. So you have representatives, okay? And this ruling body of legislators and guardians can reach an infinite scale, and so it's scalable up. When they first started, I think each representative represented about 30,000 people. Today, each representative in America represents just under 1 million people, okay? And so it's scalable. So there will be a dual form of representation as well. One will be by state, and this will be the Senate, and the other one will be by number, and this will be the House. So Rhode Island, which is a tiny state, the smallest state, has the same level of representation as a large state, say California. And so they're equals in the Senate. Each one has 2 senators. And so here there is a type of equality, but it's not an equality based upon size. So the principle of representation here is simply by the state's status. But in the House, the rule is proportional by size. So California has far more representatives than anyone else, but especially than Rhode Island, because there it is proportional. It's proportioned according to size. And so you have 2 principles of representation at work here. So a larger body is more stable, just as a large ship is more stable than a small boat. A small boat, big wave comes along, the small boat can be easily destabilized. But when a large wave comes along in a large ship, you barely even notice it. It's easier for it to stay stable. And so likewise with a large republic. And so this is what they're hoping to do to stabilize the U.S. government. In Federalist 39, our next reading, this Federalist paper will explain how the new Constitution adheres to a republican principle. The term republic comes from res publica. That means the public entity or the public thing, the public substance, if you will, the public existence. And so Madison explains that the name has been inappropriately used throughout history. Many countries are republic in name only. but they're not actually republics in the way they function. Not even England. Okay, now England, much of our political thought emerges from England. Going all the way back to Magna Carta, all the way up through Locke, the Glorious Revolution, and so forth and so on. A lot. I mean, after all, the colonists were English, and so they greatly respected England. And they derived a lot of their thought from a French thinker as well, named Montesquieu. And Montesquieu admired England and a lot of the type of legal things that had happened there. But they're trying to move beyond that. In other words, build upon it and go further, okay? But Madison lays down what he thinks are the essential, it boils it down to the simplest element, the essential features of a true republic. And that is this: power truly derives directly from the people, not an aristocracy or a nobility. So, let's think back to the Roman Republic, which is a great example of republican form of government throughout history, but it's based on an aristocracy. The power didn't derive from the people. To be a Roman senator, you had to come from the patrician class. And so, a true republic has to derive its power directly from the people through consent, of course, okay? And so each representative, each person in the legislature has to be voted upon, has to come about through consent, okay? So that's what's going to make a true republic. Second, the government is administered by people holding offices for a limited term. And this is laid down in the Constitution, explained very well in the Federalist Papers. The idea being here that they need to have a limited term. Now, this is not the same thing as term limits. We have term limits for the president, but that was not laid down in the Constitution. We don't have term limits for senators or Republicans or representatives now, but they do serve for a limited term. In other words, they have to be reelected frequently, okay? And so those two things, in other words, you couldn't just get elected once and stay in office for the rest of your life. If you're going to stay in office for the rest of your life, you're going to have to be reelected many times. In other words, the people are going to have to consent continually to you staying there. So these are the two essential elements for a true republic, according to Madison. So the office of the House of Representative, if you're going to be there, a representative, it's 2 years. It's very short term. And what we see here is a democratic principle at work. In other words, the Founding Fathers took the three basic forms of government and blended them together in an unusual way, a hybrid way, and in such a way that each of these ruling principles is going to balance out and keep in check the other. So, there are only three ways to organize people ultimately. You have rule by the many, or all. That's the democratic principle of rule. You have rule by a few, and that's the aristocratic principle of rule. And you have a rule by one, and this is the monarchical principle of rule. They will take all three. They all have strengths and weaknesses. They will take all three and blend them together in this unique republic in such a way that consent is behind or the root of all three. So, in the House of Representatives, you have a democratic principle here. You have to be reelected every 2 years. That's pretty quick. Every time you turn around, you've got to be reelected. And so that means that your will, what you do as a representative, has to be very close to the will of the people. And then you have senators who can rule for 6 years, or rule or legislate for 6 years. This is the aristocratic principle. The idea here being that it's a very long, stable term. 6 years is a pretty long time. And so, and if they've done well, most of the time they go on to be elected again. And so this is, and it's also a very small body. In the House, you have 435 members. In the Senate, you have 100. So it's a small body, a small group of usually, and they had to be older as well. And so a small group of older people who rule with wisdom for a very long period of time. This is kind of an aristocratic type of principle here. In the president, this is a monarchical principle. The president is the executive, and he has executive powers. That is, he has energetic powers to do things quickly without approval. For example, to defend the country against invasion. All right. And so the president is for a 4-year term. Now, the judges, this is the judicial branch, they spell this out as well. They rule for life as they should, but upon good behavior or health. Okay. So he says that the character of the government is clearly what he calls a federal republic. Sometimes people refer to it as a democratic republic, due to the explicit demand for consent from each state. Each state must consent to this. Now, federal is a word that means that something is based on a covenant or agreement. Okay, so a confederation is with a meaning with, but a federal form of government that is with the consent of the people. But a federal government means based on covenant or agreement. So you can see a federal republic is this representative type of rule that he's laid out, a true republic that comes from consent.